the passing of a pope generates reverence and reflection around the world, followed closely by one of the most watched votes in the world, the anointment of a successor. Christopher White, the Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter, comes to us today from Rome to help us better understand what's in play and how all this may play out within the confines of one of the holiest structures on earth, the Sistine Chapel. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., it's 13th and Park.
The hard things that are necessary, we either do it or we'll pay the price down the road.
That often is missing in politics.
We have to solve everything.
It's a nightmare.
You and I can differ, but that doesn't mean you and I cannot be friends.
I have faith in the American people.
Those are the facts.
The Illuminati, right there. Aliens could have invaded and nothing would surprise me at this point.
We went from North Korea to M&M. That's a lot, man.
What's in this tea?
So, Christopher, great to have you joining us today from Rome. Obviously, these are fascinating days. The world was transfixed by the funeral of the Pope. An amazing person. You think about it. He lived very simply, very modestly, even in death, when his coffin was not on an elevated platform. It was there, at eye level with the people he served. You traveled with Pope Francis, right? What was he like?
Yeah, I had the pleasure of covering Pope Francis in probably about somewhere over 24 countries, from the capitals of Europe, places like Belgium, but also, more remote areas, South Sudan, the Congo, East Timor, Papua New Guinea. And I have to say these international travels were really when you saw the Pope in his element. Mm-hmm. You could go back to when he was elected in 2013. I think one of the reasons why he captured the imagination of the world was because he was almost sort of just intensely focused on the people, not those in authority, but he really wanted to connect with the everyday person, Catholic or not. And so when he was on the road, this was a moment or moments for him to be freer. Mm-hmm. He often said that being in the Vatican often felt like being in prison. But when he got out of the Vatican, he was unshackled. He was a free man. I've got, scores of stories I can tell, but one that captures who he is very well, I think, was last September. Mm-hmm. He went on a 2-week swing through Asia and Oceania. It was a 4-country trip over 2 weeks. Most people, including myself, thought he was foolish at 87 years old and in poor health to undertake such a journey. But he went to Papua New Guinea, and not just the capital, but he went to this remote town on the edge of the jungle. He had to be strapped in with his wheelchair on an Australian Air Force military plane.
Wow.
And this was this tiny, tiny town in a place that often sees a Catholic priest maybe every few months. And there was an inability for him to actually get there for so long. Multiple Vatican officials had tried to make the journey. They failed. So we weren't even sure if he was going to be able to pull this off. But he did. This place that never really sees a priest every 2 or 3 months saw the Pope, and he wore a headdress and he was with the people. And that was, who he is: stubborn, determined, and fearless, because he wanted to connect. He said, I want you to know you're not forgotten.
He brought into play a pastoral, less rigid approach to the position. But now we are about to face the anointment of a new Pope. And in a way, it's a square off between two words: unity and diversity. What does that mean?
Yeah, I think the Catholic Church is really at a crossroads right now, because the Cardinals, when they go into the Sistine Chapel for this, ultra secretive election process, they're going to have to decide, do they want to continue on the path of reform that Francis initiated, opening the church up to the modern world, to making its structures more inclusive, more participatory? Or do they want to initiate a course correction? People want to say, what's wrong with unity?
Right.
But in recent days, unity has almost become a placeholder for turning back the clock and not initiating and pushing ahead with the reforms that Pope Francis so wanted to see in the Catholic Church. Whereas diversity is a recognition that the Catholic Church is made up of 1.4 billion people around the globe, and it's going to look a lot different in the United States than it's going to look in places like, the Congo or South Sudan, and there are going to be different priorities, and things might need to be handled differently.
Give us kind of the highlights of what we should be looking for as we get to May 7th, the beginning of the conclave itself.
Between now and May 7th, when they enter the Sistine Chapel, cardinals are gathered in what are known as general congregations. These are closed-door meetings where they can have frank discussions about the state of the world, what they'd like to see in the church. So a range of things are going to be discussed. The last time there was a conclave was 2013, and the Catholic Church was really wrestling with a number of internal challenges, particularly its failures on clergy sex abuse, financial reforms. The house was a mess, and it was very much inward focused. This conclave will be a bit different. It will be about, does the church want to continue to advance in opening itself up to the modern world in the way that Francis was nudging it to do so? So I think it will be, in a sense, more external focused in these backdoor meetings. So what to look for? That's hard to say because the dean of the College of Cardinals who presides over these meetings has been saying, look, guys, don't talk to the press. So it's my job, of course, to convince them otherwise. My job and my colleagues' job is to say, what are the issues bubbling up in that room? Where are the fault lines? How much of the room is in favor of electing a candidate in the mold of Francis? And it may not be someone with the same personality as Francis, but someone that shares the same priorities as him. Or how many people have an appetite for something different?
So you wrote recently there are three primary factors that are in play here: theology, geography, and personality. Let's go through those quickly. So theology.
Pope Francis was known as a pastor. The past two popes before him, John Paul II and Benedict, they were a theologian and a philosopher. They were great intellectuals, but I think most people would say, they wanted moral clarity to draw lines in the sand and make it clear to the world where the Catholic Church stood. And it was almost as if you had to go through a checklist to get in the door. Pope Francis, on the other hand, changed things. His big mantra that he repeated ad nauseum was that the Catholic Church should be open to todos, 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 tutti, 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 everyone, everyone, everyone. Two different visions of what the church should be like. That's sort of the differences in theology that the cardinals are now asked to sort of decide between.
Let's talk about geography where, as you said, there are about 1.3, 1.4 billion Catholics, right? But the shift has happened in terms of the population, in terms of the growth of population of Catholics around the world. Is that kind of a somewhat new factor in play?
Oh, for sure. Where we see the church growing most rapidly is in Africa and Asia. And often the things that the church there values is out of sync with the things that are valued in Europe and North America. And so certainly you'll find Catholic prelates in Europe and in North America that are much more open on questions of sexuality, gender, whereas these are, much more taboo in Africa and Asia. Mm-hmm. That's not across the board, but, when we're painting with broad brushstrokes. There are also differences in questions like, matters of war and peace. These sort of geopolitical fault lines find their way into the discussions that are happening in these closed-door meetings as well.
And now you get to the fun one for me, personality. The interesting thing is I was reading about things like the whispers that are going on among the cardinals, the interventions, as I think they call them, right? There's mini speeches that some of the contenders would be making between now and May 7th. And of course, as a media consultant, I'm thinking, who's writing those speeches? Do they all write those speeches themselves? Do they have a group around them that kind of coaches them a little bit? How does that work?
I think, as would any sort of setting, you kind of, ally or, go around with your closer friends and collaborators. So, at night when they're having dinner with one another, you're sitting at the same table with the ones you're more sympathetic toward. They all have chances to speak freely in these meetings. And it's a chance for them to sort of speak about their own backgrounds, their own experience as pastors in the church. Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who was elected as Pope Francis in 2013, gave a 4-minute intervention that most people would say clinched his ascent to the papacy.
Wow.
Because he said, look, I think the Catholic Church is too self-referential. And that really was attractive for a lot of the guys who voted for him. Of course, all this is happening behind closed doors, so we're not sure what many of these guys are talking about at the moment. But I can guarantee you they're going to be talking about issues of, do we need a charismatic leader like Francis that appeals to the masses?
Right.
Do we need a man of governance who really understands management, who is going to be focused more on in-house matters? Can we strike a balance between the two? It's a very difficult thing to do.
Are there certain cardinals that kind of lead that part of the discussion, or is that just a general open kind of riff within the Sistine Chapel?
Within every continent, if you will, there are certain kingmakers that emerge who know all the players, where, a certain cardinal from Europe can talk to a cardinal from Africa and will say, which direction are your guys leaning? Have you considered so and so? They're moving the pieces on the chessboard to try to very discreetly shift votes. I mean, it's completely prohibited by church law to openly campaign for the job of pope.
Right.
Catholics believe that the Holy Spirit is somehow invested and leading this entire process, but he has to use, human actors to do this. And I think, many of them are keen to play their part to do just that.
How important is it that this next pope can command the world stage? Because when I think back to Pope Francis, he really did that. He did that beautifully and very humbly. But there's almost an expectation, I think the rest of the world has, maybe beyond Catholics around the world, that the Pope is kind of bigger than life, right? Is that a quality that the Cardinals might be looking for in the one they're going to anoint?
There are a few places that have the sort of convening power as the Vatican. I think, certainly the UN, the joint sessions of Congress, where you get a world leader that, addresses the entirety of Congress. It's a real bully pulpit, the papacy. It has that potential to be. And I think many people saw Francis as keen to use that, even though Francis himself wasn't that interested in, VIPs and dignitaries. His interest was really on the ordinary, what he would often call God's holy, faithful people, was a phrase that he used often, which he just meant the average person trying to live a life of faith. That's what he was interested in. When he could use his authority and his position of power to put his thumb on the scale, he did. We certainly saw that on debates over migration, climate change, certainly his endless calls to see an end to the war in Gaza. And I think, the Vatican is aware of its unique position, and the cardinals are aware that a pope will be elected at a time where there's great division in the world, and they're going to want to find someone that can speak to the moment.
Pick three of the candidates, three of the contenders that you feel they kind of represent kind of the major choices that are before the men who are going to be in that conclave soon enough.
Let me begin with a disclaimer that there's an old saying that he who enters a conclave as pope leaves as a cardinal. So, there are no political parties in the Catholic Church. There's no formal nominating process. And so we're left reading the tea leaves, and it can be quite challenging. That being said, certain names continue to emerge. I'll give you three that are representative of different camps. Filipino Cardinal Luis Tagle. He is the former Archbishop of Manila. He now works here in Rome. He was brought to Rome by Francis. He is often referred to as the Asian Francis because of his real focus on humility and particular concern for the poor. But he has star power. There are videos of him on YouTube singing karaoke. He knows how to work a room. And the folks that are pushing for someone who is outward facing like Francis are going to look at him and say, he might be our guy.
Right.
I'd point to Cardinal Pietro Parolin as someone sort of in the middle. He was Francis's long-serving Secretary of State, and he's a diplomat. He is not going to light the world on fire. He has spent, his entire life trying to stay out of the spotlight, dealing with world leaders. He has a great grasp on world affairs, but he's not Mr. Personality. In fact, he can be a little painful to listen to at times. Having an electrifying pope like Francis followed by someone like Parolin would be a shock to the system, but he's a serious contender in this conclave. And then I would say the candidate of change would be Hungarian Cardinal Peter Erdu. He is very much the candidate of those who would describe themselves as anti-Francis. He's a law and order sort of guy. He's known to have been quite friendly with Viktor Orban in Hungary, much more sort of nationalistic in his own sort of preferences, quite controversially rejected accepting migrants into Hungary at a time when Pope Francis was prioritizing migration for the Catholic Church. He would be seen as someone who would really be, in a sense, a complete rejection of the Francis vision. It's hard for me to imagine a world in which there are enough votes for the Cardinals to line up behind him. But I think he has to be taken seriously as a candidate who represents that faction within the body of the College of Cardinals.
Do you think this is going to be a relatively quick vote? I mean, there are times in history when it took a very long time.
I think they want a fairly quick conclave. The last two conclaves were 2 days each. I would be shocked if this one goes beyond 3 days. I ran into one of the cardinal electors a few days ago, and I said to him, what are you dreading about this whole process? And he said, I'm dreading being away from my iPad once they lock us in. So, I think that just goes to show you they may be cardinals, but they're human too, and they don't want to be cut off from the outside world for that long.
A lot of people were kind of mesmerized recently by the movie Conclave. And one of the complaints in showing it wasn't really reflective of reality was, I think, the electronics that were brought inside the Sistine Chapel. How close was that movie to the essence of the process, forgetting the dramatics and the subterfuge, whatever, the basics of the process?
I think it was very faithful. I mean, Conclave to me was a love letter to the Vatican's pomp and circumstance and the ritual that goes with it. I mean, they followed closely the protocol of electing a new pope. Now, there were elements integrated into that were completely, fiction, but that's okay. That's what Hollywood is allowed to do, to expand our imagination. Right. What is very real is that there are lots of backroom conversations happening in these days, and people have divided loyalties, and they're wrestling with their own internal demons and priorities when they are thinking about how to cast what will be one of the most critical votes of their lifetime. And I think Conclave captured that spectacularly, and kudos to them for timing this so well.
How did you get involved in reporting, basically for the Catholic Church, on behalf of the Catholic Church, about the Catholic Church? How did you get there?
Oh, by total accident. I finished graduate school in 2013, around the time Francis was elected. I knew this was kind of an interesting moment in the life of the Catholic Church, and that's how I stumbled into journalism covering the church. I write for the National Catholic Reporter, an independent paper that were the first paper to ever report on clergy sex abuse in the United States, completely independent, not tied financially to the Catholic Church, which allows us to hold the institution accountable and to report freely. And that's the only way I would want to do it, because I think journalism matters across the board. And, you have an institution like the Catholic Church that is pretty secretive, and it's a fun task to sort of figure out what's happening behind those palace walls.
Well, Chris, we want you to keep writing every day if you can, because frankly, this is still a relatively new process for a lot of us. The more we know, the better. And this goes beyond religion. It goes into basic matters of faith and about something that once in a while kind of stills the whirling waters of the world, and everyone is watching and hoping and praying. And we appreciate the time you're taking to report today from Rome.
And we'll come back and talk about the new guy at some point.
Looking forward to it.